Hello, everyone, and welcome back to your course, Qualitative Research Writing and Publishing. So, after a brief introduction into qualitative research in your first lesson, we will now move on to understand some of the best practices in conducting qualitative research and in also in writing research. So, the things that we will be discussing in this lesson, some of these points are very specific to qualitative research in particular, and some of it, I would say, are pointers that you should keep in mind in doing and writing research in general. So, yes. In our last lesson, I already spoke to you about paradigms and your belief systems that influences the way that you do your research and the various decisions that we make in our research process. So, in research, we are always making decisions about what we see. And that means that because of those decisions, there are things that we will obviously not see. But in order for us to understand what is it that we are seeing and what is it that we are not seeing, it the reflexivity is a major component of that, where you have to be mindful of your thoughts, your decisions, and how who you are is influencing this decision process. So that means that research results will always be biased by the choices that we make. Although in quantitative research, there is this high or predominant belief that there can be no bias and that bias can be removed by certain elements of reliability, validity, and etc. In qualitative research, as I spoke earlier, bias is a human component, and it's not something that is looked upon as negatively, but rather something that we acknowledge as human beings, because as human beings we are all biased. So there is nothing wrong with that, but acknowledging that who you are influences the decision making process is important. And yes, there are processes in qualitative research as well that gives emphasis to these biases, so as to kind of expose your biases and to directly say who you are and how this study is influenced by who you are and the limitations that can occur because of those aspects. So, part of the researcher's job, especially in qualitative research, is to make that bias as obvious as possible, right? So, and in research, and part of this is accepting some of these statements. For example, research report is one representation of reality. So, as I discussed in our previous lesson, what the primary belief of positivism is that research can be generalized and the concept of universal knowledge. But in qualitative research, the emphasis is that the research report is only one representation of reality, and the same reality could be interpreted in multiple ways by multiple people. So, our job in whatever representation of reality that you are producing as a researcher, your job is to give the best representation that you can. And that includes a description of the purpose of the representation, why and with what uh, uh, context is this representation built. And sometimes, obviously, as I said, there are limitations to these representations that we create out of our research, that we develop out of our research. So we have to own up to these limitations. And that's how these pointers that I'll be explaining next comes in. And I would say these are some of the main pointers in doing or rather developing good qualitative work. And as I said in our introduction video, there is no 1, 2, 3 step guide to publishing qualitative research, but rather your focus should be to produce research of quality. And these pointers that I am discussing today is or rather are the points that one should be mindful, qualitative researchers should be mindful in order to develop something of value, of quality. So point number one is subjectivity and intersubjectivity. Our perceptions, experiences, expectations, personal or cultural understandings and beliefs are very specific to ourselves, and that informs the individual's judgment about truth and reality. And if I am to explain this in simple words, I would say it means that who we are and how we have been taught, and the specific way that we have been taught with certain belief systems and structures, influences the way that we see reality or we experience reality. Or let's say, what example can I take here? Let's say two people in a relationship, right? And these two people obviously come from different backgrounds, different experiences. It could be that they're from the same country, maybe they have the same religious background, but doesn't mean that it's just because they may carry those two similar labels, that their experience of the world or their perceptions would be the same. No, because even with those similar labels that define those two people, their experiences in life could have been different. And the way that they have been taught could have been different. And the things that they have experienced and or the kind of things they have experienced in life could have taught them different things, or could have taught them to look at the world in a different way. And because of that, they would their perception and their outlook about the world could be different. So even in a relationship, let's say between two people, and often you might hear it that the one partner has a perception about the same situation in a different light than the other partner. And this could be in any relationship, whether it's a friendship, a partnership, or work relationship. It could be many things, but you would see, and I'm sure you have experienced as well, that that you see the situation in a different way and another person sees the situation in a different way, and sometimes you feel that what you did is right, and someone else thinks that what you did is wrong. So but this right, wrong, or our perception of whatever given situation, that is based on our own perceptions, experiences, expectations, cultural backgrounds, and so many other structures within which we have grown up and learned in life. So it's important for us to acknowledge these subjectivities, right? And one of the ways that I came to realize about my own biases and subjectivities is by reading. And I will speak a bit more about this later on as well. If you're someone who reads a lot, or I would say you can do this exercise where you pay attention to the kind of emotions that you feel as you're reading any text, right? As I was doing my research, the different kinds of text that I was reading, there were sometimes that I was reading books that made me feel very angry. There were some texts that I read that made me feel very sad and emotional in a very I don't want to say negative, but I'd say just sad. So many different kinds of emotions that I felt as I was reading through different texts. And at first, this was rather oblivious. I was oblivious to it, and I wasn't really paying attention to these emotions. And after a while, as I started learning about reflexivity, I started paying attention to my emotions, and I saw patterns, and I recognized that in reading certain arguments or certain perspectives, I would feel angry. So I started thinking about why is it that I would feel angry, and a lot of times these texts that I felt angry about, it didn't enter my research work, right? So oftentimes your biases are very much uh, under the ground. You don't realize it, right? And you have to you have to kind of pay very specific attention to these things to understand what your biases are. But subjectivity and the emphasis on intersubjectivity is that you the way that you see the world is very subjective to who you are and the structures within which you have grown up, and the way that you give meaning to things is also entangled in intersubjectivity, meaning that, and this is an argument that is very extensive as well, is there anything uh, that is uniquely your own thought, or do we make meaning out of interaction with other people's thoughts and behaviors and etc., right? So subjectivity and intersubjectivity, where you give meaning to things based on the meanings that has been given to these phenomena by other people. And that's how we give meaning to the things that we see in the world as well as ourselves. We give subjective meanings to ourselves. As I said in our previous lesson, human beings are people of creatures of stories, right? So in every story there is a central kind of theme, and that and or rather central kind of discourse that is grounded in specific beliefs, and it would influence your perspectives. One example that I can give here is I don't know if you've heard the phrase work hard, play hard, right? So, in the kind of structure that we live in, if you're not employed, employment has a huge value in current structure. So, if you're not earning, if you're not doing something with your life that contributes to the central structure, then you have been made to believe that you're not a productive person in society, right? And there's a lot of discourses that support these beliefs. So when you grow up in these beliefs, it influences the way that you look at the world, that you look at yourself, and that you look at other people. Right. So if you find someone who isn't necessarily doing a job that that is defined as productive in this society, you might consider them to be lazy or unproductive or not valuable people, and etc., right? So there's a lot of prejudices like this in the world as well, about what is normal, what is not normal, how you should always act to be normal, you shouldn't go outside of the normal, etc., etc. There's so many beliefs like this in the world, right? How and it kind of determines that, okay, if you're a man, you should be like this. If you're a woman, you should be like this. If you're someone who's rich, you should look like this. If you're someone poor, you should look like this. If you're educated, you should be like this. If you're uneducated, you should be like this, and etc. There's so many ideas like this in the world, and all of these aspects that we learn at home and outside from the society through so many different platforms, it influences our perceptions, experiences, expectations, understandings, and beliefs. And this influences how we see ourselves in the world and how we see other people. And this is subjectivity. right? It is very much unique to each individual. And this subjectivity and intersubjectivity influences everything that you do, including your research, right? So, in qualitative research, we pay very specific attention to these subjectivities so as to acknowledge our positionality. What is positionality? So, after understanding what is our subjective position, right, in terms of our mentality, in terms of our identity, in terms of who we are, how we see things, and etc., it's important for you to position where you stand, right, and say, I see what I am disposed to see, and the reason why I see it like this is because of these specific reasons that makes me who I am, right? And positionality also acknowledges that when I see something, it also means that there's a lot of other things that I don't see. I'll give you another example. And actually, there's so many examples, but this is an example that has always kind of stayed in my mind. And this was when I was studying in the UK. And there was one time, me and one of my friends, she was from Croatia, and she was a very skinny person, and you could say that she was someone who was very she put a lot of emphasis on weight. She was someone who, I guess, wanted to gain weight, but anyways, she was someone who put a lot of emphasis on the weight aspect of things. And one day we were walking down the high street, and after a while of walking, she said to me, "Oh, there's so many fat people," and I was a bit confused, and I told her, "Really? I hadn't noticed that." And I didn't think about that experience much, but as I was learning about this subjectivity and positionality and etc., I realized that, yeah, actually, because of because of the her own perceptions, her own experiences, and her own emphasis in her own identity, she was paying attention to this aspect of weight as we were walking, whereas my attention was somewhere completely different. I was observing other things, which, and I did not observe fat people on the street. And this is something that I've experienced many times, and even you could try it as well. You can walk down a street with two or three of your friends, and at the end of walking down, you can each ask yourself, what did you observe? And it would be a very interesting conversation, because you would have walked down the same street, but you would end up observing different things based on who you are and your perceptions about the world, right? So this is where subjectivity and positionality comes in, right? So, how does subjectivity and positionality influence the research process? It influences the research process, I would say, throughout the whole research, starting from the kind of topic that you choose, the kind of things that you would read to frame your research work, and the kind of things that you would ignore in the process of reading, and the way that you would design your research, the way that you would, the kind of methods and methodology that you would choose, and the way that you would gather your data. If you're doing interview, even the way that you would ask questions, and the way that you would analyze your whatever data that you have collected in your research. And after analyzing, the way that you would write about your findings and the way that you would conclude your findings, all of these things would be influenced by your own perceptions of what what something should be like, right? So in our earlier lesson, I took the example of a student who wanted to do research in terms of higher education, and he had this uh, very specific idea of what quality education should look like. And he got these ideas from certain ideologies out there in the world, and it influenced the way that he was writing his research, because at the end he was concluding his research in a way that aligned with his idea of what good education should look like, right? So your subjectivities and your positionality influences the whole research process. And that is why in qualitative research, we pay specific attention to reflexivity. And I would say reflexivity is very important when it comes to producing research of value, right? So, since study design, data collection, and analysis are to some extent the product of the researcher's positionality, it is crucial to research that a researcher makes the influences on subjectivity as apparent as possible, right? So, subjectivity, in acknowledging subjectivity, we acknowledge that our perception of reality, our perception of phenomena, our perception of the world is very much subjective. And in positionality we also acknowledge these subjectivities. And in reflexivity, the work of reflexivity is to situate yourself. Okay, I am grounded in these subjectivities. And this is my positionality. This is where I'm grounded. And these aspects of who I am influences the research in this way, right? That is the act of reflexivity. So, in quantitative research, often researchers do this by eliminating as many influences of the researcher as possible, including aspects of validity and reliability. And I would say this is a major debate about researcher bias. And although quantitative research says that no, you can eliminate completely the researcher bias through certain elements, and that the researcher can completely stay detached from their research and not influence the research process. There's a lot of debate around this, that with some people saying no, it's possible, and another group saying no, it's highly impossible, right? But in qualitative research, we won't go into that debate because that's not part of this lesson. And in qualitative research, we do this by including rigorous self reflection on the research process in the final report, right? So it can be anywhere in the report as well. So oftentimes, if you're doing a PhD, in your thesis, you would have a whole section either in your methodology or in your uh, literature or in your introduction, where you would situate yourself reflexively. You will situate yourself and you would kind of explain how this research is influenced who you are, what your paradigmatic beliefs are, and how these aspects influence the different processes of the research, right? And I would say the reason why we as qualitative researchers we do this part is so that the person who's reading your research or the knowledge that you develop, the person who would refer to this knowledge knows who had developed this knowledge and how who developed the knowledge has influenced the research process. It's about being transparent, right? And I'll give you an example why reflexivity is very important. Right? This is an activity that I did in one of the PhD qualitative research classes that I taught. And I posed my student a simple question. I asked them, what is knowledge? Right? What do you consider as knowledge? And these are some of the answers that they gave me. They told me that knowledge is articles that are published in top journals. Knowledge is what is written in English. Knowledge is uh, knowledge that is universal. Knowledge is from articles that are highly cited. Knowledge is secluded to things that are in the written form or are published. Knowledge is what has been produced by reputable authors. And when I say reputable, the word reputable is often today, especially, synonymous to highly cited authors and coming from reputable universities. And reputable universities here often is synonymous to what is highly ranked in certain ranking systems, right? And knowledge is things or articles or whatever published material that are international. And knowledge is what you find on Google, right? And this was interesting because I asked them, okay, when you search for something on Google, how many pages of Google search results do you go into before you decide that, okay, this is it, this is all that's been written about this topic? And the answer that I got is maximum about 2 pages, 2 to 3 pages is what students would often go to before they decide that, okay, there's nothing written about this topic outside of that. Even when there are hundreds and thousands of pages that come in the search results, oftentimes students would only go up to maximum 3 pages before they decide that's all knowledge is. That's all the knowledge about this topic, right? So after getting these answers, I drew this huge circle on the board and this tiny little dot in that huge circle. And I explained to my students that if this huge circle is the world of knowledge, then whatever answers they gave here represents this tiny dot in this world of knowledge. And imagine if when you're doing your research, you are only including this much in developing a perspective and you are ignoring this much of knowledge in the process. What do you think is the impact of that in the knowledge that you create as researchers, right? So, this is why it's very important to be mindful about the choices that you're making in your research and how your subjective perceptions and your subjective beliefs about specific things influences how you do research and what you include and the decisions that you make in your research process, right? And I would say oftentimes today when people are doing research, this is their understanding of what knowledge is. And oftentimes in your readings you would stick to the same kind of aspects in choosing your readings, and there's a whole area of knowledge that is excluded in the process, right? So I wanted to bring this example to emphasize why it's so important to incorporate reflexivity in your research process. And I have also written an article about it. This is based on my own research, my PhD topic, which was about how colonial and neo-colonial structures of power influences the knowledge production and dissemination process in Asia, right? So this article was actually a reflexive piece of my research experience through this research journey. So I was researching coloniality, and I myself come from Sri Lanka, which is a former British colony. So my identity was also very much ingrained within this colonial beliefs and systems and etc. So it was a major struggle for me to also do this research, because on one side was my identity, which was formed in this specific belief structure that was very much grounded in colonialism. And on the other side, I was trying to study the same phenomena, which was colonialism. So I spoke in this article, I speak about the complexities of identity and how it influences the research process. So I speak from my own experience because throughout my research I kept a diary, and in that diary I wrote down I wrote about my experiences, the kind of emotions that I went through as I was doing the research, and how I felt throughout the process, especially when I was conducting my fieldwork. There were moments that I went into interviews and I came out and I was very emotional, and moments where I cried and etc. So I wrote all of these experiences in a field in a kind of a diary. And the reason I did this was also because I wanted to be mindful about my emotions, so that I don't let my emotions cloud what I see. So I wrote down these things. So this article is specifically based on these reflective diaries that I kept throughout my PhD. And in this article, I speak about the complexities of identity and how it influenced the research process and the difficulties that you face in the process, and the different stages of reflexivity that one must go through in order for them to understand, or rather situate themselves, their subjectivities and their positionalities, and the emotions, the emotional struggles that a researcher goes through in doing their research, and the limitations of reflexivity as well, and how all of these aspects influences the kind of representation we create as researchers. So I highly encourage you to read it if you're interested, to understand more about reflexivity and why reflexivity is important. And another aspect of why reflexivity is important is to kind of understand emotions, right? The emotions of a person obviously influences the researcher, and the researcher's emotions also influence the people who are being researched, and the participants' emotions also influences the researcher. And all of these emotions influences the research process and the research in total, right? So part of part of reflexivity is also to be mindful of the emotions of a research, and to understand how these emotions are playing a part in your research decisions, right? So why is all of this important? I think I have explained all of this now, but let's go through it anyways. So as I said, how you gather and analyze data is influenced by what you intend to do with the results. Different purposes, different processes. You have to be careful that you get the right study design for the right purpose, right? So you can debate the word right here, right? Because what is right is essentially, again, a subjective perspective, right? But the underlying essence of this message is that you have to be mindful of who you are and what you are seeing because of who you are, and what you are not seeing because of who you are. And as the circle and the dot that I showed in the previous slide, what you see could be very, very, very tiny, whereas what you don't see could be a whole universe, right? And so, in quantitative research, oftentimes there is this element of validity, right? Research is valid when it is accurate and it can be generalized uh, and the findings can be generalized about the phenomena being investigated, and it should be generalized beyond the context of the study, right? And accuracy, the study design and execution does not impact the results, and then the instruments or variables are also validated through different processes in quantitative research. So over the history of research, and in our previous lesson, I also showed you the different moments of qualitative research. The researchers have continuously adopted certain rules to establish validity of research. And these rules have often been predominantly positivist in nature, uh, where there is a objective truth out there for researchers to find, and this truth is universally acceptable, and that findings can be generalized to whole populations, right? And oftentimes the belief is that, oh, if you follow these rules, then you would be able to produce valid research. But in qualitative research, we contest these rules, right? Because no matter how much you try to follow the steps and etc., you cannot remove who you are from the research. So instead, in qualitative research, we have these aspects, or these are four aspects that are taken from this source. If you want to read further, it's called the TACT framework. And these aspects provide a certain element of validity. This is qualitative research's way of providing validity for their research, right? So TACT stands for trustworthiness, auditability, credibility, and transferability. Trustworthiness is it requires establishing confidence in your findings. So, some of the things you need to ask under trustworthiness, or in order to build trustworthiness in your research, is what were the questions that you asked, right? So, in your methodology, you need to explain how did, if let's say you did interviews or focus groups in your research. So, you need to explain the process of how you created the questions and why you included these questions and what kind of questions. It's even better to provide the list of questions itself, right? And but you would also have to explain why and how did you come to choose these questions, and why did you choose these questions for your objectives, who carried out the research, right? So uh, you need to give a background about the researcher. How was the how was the data analyzed? And so you need to give the process of how you did the analysis. So in my research, I did 3 levels of coding. So I extensively explained how each of the coding stages was conducted. And in explanation, I also gave examples like an audit trail of my coding process and the verification of data with theory and with participants. I can give you an example here as well. So one of the things that I did in my research, in my PhD, was to, after I had coded, after I had transcribed my interviews and I had coded the interviews, I sent out all of these findings to my participants again, and to ask them to verify what I have analyzed. And if they had any concerns or if they didn't agree, they had the platform, they had the opportunity to communicate that with me, right? And the second aspect is auditability. The researcher clearly describes how the data was collected, where, when, how analysis was undertaken, right? So you, from the moment of you choosing a specific methodology and a specific method until the point of analysis, you have to explain each step. So if you picked a certain kind of method, then why did you pick this method? If you picked a certain kind of participants to interview or a specific culture that you want to study, then why? Why were these people selected and others not selected? How did these people uh, How do these people, these participants that you have selected, linked to your research objectives, and why did you how did you conduct your interviews? Did you record it? How did you transcribe it? And was it structured, semi-structured, unstructured? So all of these details need to be specified in order to provide auditability. And it requires a higher degree of transference, meaning that by reading the process of your research, someone else should be able to follow the same steps and come to maybe collect the same data as you. That is what you need to provide. Basically, all of these aspects is about providing transparency to your research process. And the third step is creditability. Credibility. Credibility evaluates whether or not the representation of data fits the views of the participants studied, whether the findings hold true. Again, you can debate the idea of true, but the idea here is to make sure that the way that you have analyzed and your transcription aligns with what the participants had intended to say or what they said, right? So, some of the things that you can do in order to provide more value to your data is to do member checks, so validate the findings. As I said before, you can send the transcriptions and your analysis to your participants for them to have another check and see if what you have and how you have analyzed is the best representation of what they have said. And peer debriefing. I would say peer debriefing is very important, and this is something that you can often do with someone who knows about your field, or even people who don't know anything about your field. But basically, it's about sometimes when you're doing your research, you tend to be in your own bubble, right? And when you're in your own bubble, there's a lot of things that you may not see, right? Because you are cornered in the specific belief system, and you might be unable to see anything beyond that. So you need to have discussions with other people who are in the field, other people who may not be in the field, so as to gather difference of perspectives, so as to challenge the little bubble that you may be in. And by doing that, you can actually validate your perspectives further by challenging it, right? And paying attention to negative cases. Now, oftentimes in quantitative research, the outliers or the minority is often neglected. It's more focused on the majority players. But it's also important to pay attention to these negative cases. Why these negative cases exist is it's important. And so these aspects needs to be reported as well. And another thing that can be done is an independent analysis of data by more than one researcher. And this is something that we also do in most of the publications that I do, if I'm not writing alone, actually, if I'm writing with other people. When it comes to data analysis, my most recent research was done. It was a online narrative analysis of visual data, meaning pictures on Instagram. So in the process, the data was analyzed by two people, right? Actually, three people, or three of the authors. We each analyzed it on our own because we came from different backgrounds. So after analyzing it on our own, we came together to discuss the findings that we have gathered. And if there were differences, we discussed these differences. And all of these aspects of the research process was reported in our journal. And when you provide, the more details that you provide into your research process, the more transparency you provide, that there is little questions about your methodology in the process. So the more details that you provide in whether it's your PhD or whether it's a publication, the better it is. Because the less information that you provide about your research process, the more skeptical the reviewers are going to be. So it's important that you incorporate all of these aspects in the different types of studies that you may be doing, whether it's a major research such as your PhD or you're writing an article. Doesn't matter. All of these aspects should be a part of the discussion, right? And another element that must be incorporated into in the discussion of your methodology as well is ethics. How and ethics actually you can connect reflexivity to ethics as well, right? Being mindful of how the research is influencing the research process, and this in turn influence the researched. And so the reason why it's interconnected is that the researcher has to be mindful of themselves in order to be ethical, and the researcher has to be mindful of the researched, and vice versa. And so it's important to incorporate ethical steps. So this framework also involves all of these aspects, but providing all of these aspects as an open discussion is also part of being ethical, right? So by providing these aspects, you are giving more credibility to your research. And when you're going out to the field, obviously there are certain ethical steps that needs to be incorporated. Ethics really depends on the kind of research that you are doing, the kind of research topic it is, and the kind of participants that are involved, the kind of research design it is, and etc. So ethics is very much contextual to each person's research, but it's about being mindful of yourself and mindful of the people who are part of your research. And this is, I would say, one of the main important points when it comes to producing good, valuable research is to read, and read more, and read more and more. And when I say read more, and I think this is something that is rather problematic as well, because sometimes when it comes to reading, we tend to stick to things that we are comfortable in, or we tend to stick to perspectives that we are comfortable in, or we stick to perspectives that aligns with our research problem, and we don't like to read things that doesn't align to this, so we ignore this whole world of knowledge in the process. And let's say you are in the field of tourism, and sometimes I actually, or oftentimes, I see a lot of people making this mistake that they only read uh, in their own discipline, right? And thereby they miss the interconnectivity from other disciplines about the same problem. So oftentimes, if you're in tourism and you're looking at us, let's say, a specific issue in tourism, you tend to just stick to the literature that is written within the field of tourism. So you're kind of cornering yourself, right? You're cornering yourself into this tiny little bubble. And so because of that, because if your readings are cornered into a tiny little bubble, that also means that whatever that you produce is going to be cornered into a tiny little bubble. And that makes it difficult for someone to publish, because I would say, one of the major components, especially today in this competitive environment that exists in terms of publishing, one of the essential aspects that needs to be is emphasized is multidisciplinarity, meaning that you have come to discuss the literature about the issue, or uh, you have connected literature from different disciplines, right? And in our next lesson, I will also discuss this and kind of give you a process of how to write a literature and how to incorporate this multidisciplinary narrative. And I would suggest it's important that even if it's something that really angers you to read, you really don't want to read, or it doesn't align with, okay, like, okay, you want to frame a problem in a specific way, and you only read literature that helps you to do that. No, it's important that you read beyond your comfort zone and you venture into other disciplines. And because when your research is grounded in a multidisciplinary sense, it provides more value, right? So read more, and read outside of your comfort zone, outside of the tiny bubble, and read into different stories, read into different perspectives, even if there are perspectives that you don't agree with. It's all right. By reading into perspectives that you don't agree with, you are helping your critical mind, right? With that, I come to my last point of what is important when it comes to developing research of value. One of the best practices is to read critically. Criticality is very important. In qualitative research is not, and it would be very hard to publish if all what you're doing is just reporting something or re-reporting something. There is no value in that. What is of value is if you're able to read and critically analyze and critically point out that yes, these things have been done, but these are the issues and limitations of each aspect, and this is the problem of this, and etc, etc. So you have to kind of train your brain in a way that when you're reading something, you can automatically kind of visualize, yes, this is one perspective, and in this one perspective, these are all the perspectives that have not been included in this perspective, right? And the only way you can train your brain to do that is by reading reading and reading more, and from reading from different disciplines. So, critical reading is a process of analyzing, interpreting, and sometimes evaluating. When we read critically, we use our critical thinking skills to question both the text and our own reading of it. Have you ever realized, if you have read the same book twice, right, that you could read something at one point and you'll have a different meaning to that text? And you come back to it maybe after a few days, maybe even a few years, and you read the same text and you read it differently, right? So even the way that you read a text is very much grounded in you are influencing the reading process. Who you are is influencing the reading process. And maybe the book that I read at the age of 6 means something else to me now than what it made sense to me then, because obviously my mind has also grown, my perspectives have grown. So it knowledge is never stagnant, right? And knowledge is open. Reading is open to interpretation. It's not that if I read the word marginalization on a book, that I see the word marginalization and my brain interprets the word marginalization in the same way as anyone else. No. What we read, our minds are actively interpreting it, and that interpretation is always influenced by who we are and many other aspects of who we are, including the language, right? So, different disciplines have different modes of critical reading, right? But there are two main steps of preparing to read critically. One is to self reflect. I think that has been a central theme in this lesson. And the reason is because it's very important to be reflective. So, step one is self reflect. What experiences, assumptions, knowledge, and perspectives do you bring to the text? What biases might you have? And are you able to keep an open mind and consider other points of view? So that is why I said it's important to read perspectives that doesn't necessarily align with your beliefs. It's all right. You should be able to read other perspectives. And if you're unable to read other perspectives, the first question you should ask yourself is why? Why are you unable to read other perspectives? What are the prejudices and biases that you have in your mind that is making you incapable of reading another perspective or understanding another perspective, right? And note it down. And step two is read to understand. Examine the text and context. Who is the author? Who is the publisher? Where and when was it written? What kind of text is it? A lot of times, a lot of students don't realize it actually, but each of these aspects are very important. I once, this is an exercise that I will be giving you all as well. And I portrayed it in one of my classes. It was a history book that of India that was written by a British author. And I asked my students if there was anything wrong in it. And none of my students could actually point it out, right? But who you are, as we have been discussing this whole time, who you are influences your text, right? So let's say I am a Sri Lankan and I write about the indigenous culture in Malaysia, right? And I have lived in Malaysia for, let's say, 10 years, but I only lived among the indigenous people 3 months. How much of a background do I have? And how would my experience influence what I interpret? And if an indigenous author was to write about the same perspective, would they write about it the same way as I have? So, who the author of a text is important. You should be mindful to who has written the text. And you'd be surprised as how different authors from different perspectives or different backgrounds has written about the same topic in different ways, right? So in the recent times, I've been interested in reading uh, different religious texts, and I recently started reading the Quran. And um, when I was searching for translation, and I think I asked a lot of people for a translation as well, but I was very specific when I said I want it to be translated by a person who doesn't just know Arabic. I didn't want it to be translated by a person who just knew Arabic, because the Quran was revealed at a time. Language also doesn't stay stagnant, right? Language changes with the time. English 300 years ago is not the same as English today, right? So I wanted it to be written by someone who has a deep linguistic background and also a cultural background, right? And the reason for my this specification in looking for a translation for the Quran was that who you are and who the interpreter of a text is really influences the text. And so be mindful and critically evaluate the text based on these aspects. And it's also important to evaluate who the publisher is, because who the publisher is also influences how the text is written. The publisher is one of the major gatekeepers, and a publisher can tell you how you can and cannot write. And sometimes you have to write in a specific way, in a specific tone, because of who you're publishing with, right? So and also another aspect, where and when was it written? As I have said, society changes across time, right? So whatever that is written in a specific time has to be contextualized to that time because it made sense in the context of that time. So it's also important that when you're reading, you can read about the topics from different times to understand how the perspectives have developed over time. And second step in this is to skim the text. What is the topic and what are the main ideas? And then to resolve confusion, look up familiar words or terms in dictionaries or glossaries, go over different passages to clarify them. I remember when I started doing my research, which was on the topic of colonialism and neocolonialism, and there were so many words that I could not understand. And it took me a long time to understand in depth the meaning of these words. And today, there are still times that there are some things that I don't understand, but it doesn't stop me, right? Part of learning, and I think learning makes you humble, and learning makes you realize how little you know. So there is nothing wrong with acknowledging how little you know, right? But yeah, uh, one of the main aspects is to also develop a critical mind. And so, with that, you can discuss things in a way that adds value, whereas you're not just reporting, but you are actually adding value to the context of your own topic, right? And this is, I would say, some of the differences between generally reading and critically reading. It differs in its purpose, activity, focus, kind of questions you would ask, the direction, and the responses, right? So I provided this here so as to kind of give an overview of what makes these two different and how this adds value, right? So a lot of times when you're writing a publication or even in your PhD thesis or your master's thesis or whichever it is, your literature review section cannot be it shouldn't be just the reporting of previous literature. No, it has to be a critical reading, a critical perspective of what's been written before, right? And oftentimes, I think this is one of the biggest areas that a lot of researchers have a problem with is writing the literature section, right? So that's why in this aspect, I would say the two major points in this lesson is to read and read more and read from multidisciplinary perspectives. And when you're reading, to critically read the text by asking these questions that we have noted here, right? And the more you read, and the more you read from different disciplines, and the more your mind will automatically be able to ask questions, to ask critical questions. On top of reading, one of the other things that you can do as a qualitative researcher is to listen. Listen to other perspectives. Listen to people around you and their own perspectives and why they have these perspectives. Oftentimes, when we hear different perspectives, we tend to get angry, we tend to get agitated, or it doesn't align with our identity, it doesn't align with what we believe in, so we reject it. We tend to walk away from these perspectives. But I would say what makes a very good researcher is someone who can listen to other perspectives, who can absorb other perspectives, who can think about other perspectives, right? Who can be mindful of other perspectives, right? And that's one thing that is very much lacking in the academia. And that's one of the primary issues is people tend to stick within their discipline, stick within what they believe in. But what makes valuable research is going out of your comfort zone, right? So with that, I will end the lesson here. So these are some of the best practices that you need to incorporate in order to produce research of value or knowledge of value, right? And to produce something new. into this world of knowledge. So I hope you have grasped why these elements need to be incorporated and the importance of it as well. So in our next lesson, which is going to be specifically focused on the writing aspect, I will give you examples of how these aspects need to be incorporated in writing a journal article, right? And I will do so with some examples that I've taken from my own publications. So I will see you in next lesson. Thank you very much for joining me today. See you.